Okay, and we are recording. This is well, first of all, it's another episode of Things that First Year Writers Need to Hear. And this one's a little special. I have with me not one, but four different people. And I am calling this affectionately the first biannual Writing Across the Curriculum Roundtable. Whether or not there's a second biannual Writing Across the Curriculum Roundtable is an entirely different question. But there's at least a first biannual one, and that's this. Joining me today, as I continue in this officious tone, we have a returning guest, Zachary Brett. Cue the applause. For people who have watched earlier podcasts, you'll know that Zach was on the very first episode, and we talked a bit about some things we're going to be talking about today, mainly the differences between English and history writing. But Zach was a history major at Hamilton College in my year. We are also joined by I want to say you're a bio major, but as we were just discussing, there's also theater in there. Which
bio major, theater minor.
Sure. I know that's like the official thing, but like sometimes the official titles don't well represent exactly what you're well versed in. But this is
I essentially did everything in theater except a final production. So
right. And your name is Rachel Haskins, which we should say.
Yes, hi.
So also in mine and Zach's year at Hamilton, we also have the best looking of the group, David Seavey, whose camera is unfortunately off.
Yeah.
I was really counting on that winning smile, but oh well.
Yeah.
David, you were a chem major, right? Chemistry?
Yep. I was just a solo chem major.
Right. And it's worth noting that David was one of those chemistry majors who he was also in our year at Hamilton. I remember you sitting around the common room and you could take the ingredients list on the back of like a pack of Doritos or whatever, and you could tell me from the names of the ingredients what each one did chemically. Yeah. And that was wild. So that's, I guess in some oblique way, one of the reasons I have you here is because you're a particularly impressive chemistry major, at least among the ones that I know.
Yeah, I'm a geek.
Yeah, well, we all are. And then our last guest, who was also at Hamilton with us, although I guess just to clarify, a year behind, not that it really matters. Did you have any comments on that, Emily? Or
well, David was half a year behind.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, okay.
I just don't think
whatever. Anyway, this is Emily Granoff. She's another history major. So again, across the board, we now have a creative writing major, that's myself, two history majors, a bio major / theater minor, and a chem major. So, it's not the best sampling, but it's something. And as I was telling you all beforehand, what I really want this to be is, well, I want to tap you all as resources or as sources of firsthand information about what it was like to learn to write in each of your respective disciplines, with maybe an eye towards finding similarities, finding differences, finding whatever it is there is to find. I don't know. I never know where these things are going to go when we start. I think the best way to start this is to ask David the question that kind of kicked this off, at least in my thinking about it, when we were talking on unrelated things a few weeks ago. But David, you majored in chemistry, and now you are, through twists and turns, tutoring SAT prep.
Yep.
Do you want to elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, that's a lot. That's the most of what I do. Yep. Mostly just teach kids on SAT strategies and those sorts of things.
Okay. So here's the first question that I just want to toss to you, David. How has or has not Hamilton's writing education prepared you to teach, I guess, SAT writing, but SATs in general?
Yeah. Hamilton's writing in particular I thought it to be pretty useful. It's a little bit interesting, but I think I learned most of my writing in a history class I took in my freshman year with Professor Grant, actually. It was just kind of a course I took on a whim, and it was one of the best classes I took at the college, where it was really just digging into like source material, coming up with kind of an assertion, and then in the most concise way possible, making very specific claims, arguments, and then tying them together. And it was really what I think most high schoolers, it's a lot of what I teach them in their essays now. Most of the essays I work with, for the most part, are on, it's more of a mittens essays, but the same structure follows. For SAT in particular, since SAT has changed a little bit since when I took it, there's no longer a mandatory essay section. So teaching is a little bit different for that. And I don't actually teach the essay anymore since most people don't really want to do that and it's no longer mandatory. Most of the writing I teach now is mostly on, since you're looking at pre-written things, it's understanding the flow, the structure, the tone, that's a big part of it, and grammatical correctness and logical presentation of ideas. Most of which were kind of assumed at Hamilton, I would say. But definitely you could get help with that with the writing center, which I could definitely get a little bit of that. And just having professors being like, all right, this wasn't something I learned in the religious studies department. I had a professor, Dr. Shermer Horn, who you could just kind of like, if you didn't harass him too much, you could be like, hey, look at my essay. And he would give you some lowdowns and help you with all sorts of stuff and would love to just talk about it with you. That's where I got most of my learning for writing and those sorts of things.
So, dang, you threw me a curveball right off the bat. So what you're telling me is that as a chemistry major, you learned to write in the history department.
Yes.
Oh, come on. Okay, we have three history majors.
Yeah. I mean, the sort of writing you learn in the sciences is very different from the sort of writing you do in at least in high school. It's very different. You don't really do scientific writing at all in high school, or it's very lax, and maybe with the occasional lab report, which is its own separate thing. Which is different formats for that depending on what teacher you have. There's a million different lab report formats. So yeah,
Can I ask you, say more about that? And I don't know if you and Rachel want to field this one jointly, but that's something I think that I at least would like to hear more about.
Yeah. I'll just give some my brief experience with that. In high school, it's been a while since I've thought about this, but it's mostly, a lot of it was pre-formatted because they would just be like, all right, here's what you did. And they'd kind of fill up, all right, here is my results. It would be like a worksheet, that sort of thing. That was a lot of my lab reports. When I got to college, the lab reports, every different lab instructor kind of had different things they wanted. Some wanted a little bit more of a prose to it, where they actually want like you to write like a paragraph and some of that, versus others where it's just like, all right, I don't need to read that. Just be like, all right, tell me your ingredients, what you're doing, and just be like this into that in like with like arrows and stuff. Like I want to be able to look at it and see exactly what you did in like 5 seconds. And then you would be like the really shortest ones, and then you just have you would include your data at the end to kind of be like, all right, this shows that I did this, and here's a list of what happened after I did X, Y, Z. Yeah. So lab reports were interesting. I preferred some over others, and having gone farther into the sciences where you have much more formal lab reports, it was actually surprising to me how much the second one I described there is actually more of what they wanted usually. Everything wanted to just be as incredibly concise as possible with very, very brief descriptions. And then basically just attach spectrographic data to the end of it. Yeah.
So purely as I mean, they want to look through your words and see your ideas as fast as possible.
Yep. Everything wants to be as dense as possible because I don't want to have to look at it and try and figure out what was going on. Be very concise, be very clear. Pictures are great. Just like this arrow, that, indicating that I put this into that, with things like the order mannering and stuff like that, because that's something I learned when I was doing. I didn't think as much about the order if they were all listening to the same step, but that did bite me. Yeah.
Fun.
So there's definitely a downside to this method in that, especially if you can't talk to the person who wrote it, as a novice to this sort of writing, when I got to higher up, it definitely created some challenges where I wasn't able to interpret the language as easily because I wasn't used to it because I'd been given different lab report formats. So that was a disadvantage of it, in that it wasn't immediately obvious to me, but after having talked with my thesis advisor, who worked with the people who wrote these journals, I could kind of learn this is how you interpret this sort of writing, to mean like, oh, this means this person did that, but they did it in this way, which is like kind of like implied by the symbols, but if you didn't know what you were looking at, you might not have picked up on it.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So, no, that's all fascinating. Rachel, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah.
Do you?
Yeah. That's very similar to what I have experienced. And I'll only speak specifically about biology. And one of the things I know I've mentioned to some of you guys in the past is the way that biology is taught. It's a constant building process, but it's almost building in a way that it's giving it to you in a simpler format. So they'll give you something and they'll be like, all right, this is what we're going to tell you as a sophomore in high school. And then as a senior in high school, they'll tell you, well, that wasn't quite correct, but we told it to you for this kind of nondescript reason that matters for learning purposes. This is the real reason. And then you hit freshman year in college and you hear that same thing again. And then you hit senior year in college and you hear that same thing again. And it gets very frustrating as you're going through. But anyway, in regards to writing, it's almost the same thing. And so they'll take, a lot of your lab reports, and I put that in parentheses because I'm not really sure that they actually are realistic lab reports, but your lab reports in high school follow a format almost like you're writing a 5-paragraph essay or a book report. They're not a realistic...
Editor's note, blah, go on.
They're not a realistic format for an actual scientific report. But you don't know that at the time. And so when you start getting into college writing, I feel like as a freshman and even a sophomore in college, a lot of the lab reports that they're giving you are kind of trying to bridge the gap between what you've been given in high school and what you're going to be given at junior or senior year in college. And I completely agree with David. Every professor will want something different. They'll want a different format, which is going to be true of any essay, but in science, especially within one discipline, you'd kind of think that a lab report would have a similar format throughout the discipline.
You would hope that if anyone had that all figured out and like everyone was on the same page, it would be someone in the sciences, right?
You would think. And once you hit junior or senior year, you begin to realize that that is the case. They do know, they're just not teaching it to you. And so it was odd to me to begin to hit junior or senior year and be like, oh, this is how you write a scientific report. And I still have a hard time kind of understanding why that's not taught to begin with. And I think
why they instead give you this sort of string of temporarily functional half-truths.
Right, exactly.
Which I think is the way I phrased it when we were talking about it the other night. But
right, exactly. And I think some of it is trying to build your knowledge gradually, which I do understand. But once you start being able to actually read the primary literature in science, like reading specific reports, you realize in bio, almost the same as what David said in chemistry, it's condensed. I mean, you're getting a little bit more descriptions than sounds like you would in chemistry, but you're still, a lot of these reports are written to fit in a journal. They have a certain amount of columns and words that they can use.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You studied abroad in Italy. Did you take any science courses there? And did you hear anything about how they... Okay.
I didn't. I did a short 4-week program and I only took Italian. So I wasn't in an official university there. So I have no idea. Sorry.
So, forgive the interruption.
No, it's okay.
No.
I'd be curious as to how it might be different. But yeah, so I guess kind of coming out senior year, I would just say read primary literature. Like, and I mean, when we were first introduced to primary literature, and for me, it was probably junior year in college, maybe a little bit in sophomore year, you're actually taught to read even though you don't understand. Like you're taught to read through it even if you don't understand it. And eventually you will get it. But you have to almost learn how to just kind of read through the formatting even if you don't understand the formatting, and read what's there, and then you have to go back over it several times. But that's a process that in my, limited experience, which, sorry, I know, Fane, you totally told us not to say that. For me, I think would be very useful freshman year in college is to at least introduce that. Yeah, anyway, that's
fair enough. I know. I mean, that sounds like genuine modesty or genuine. So I just don't want people like, you guys are some of the smartest people that I know. So it's not useful if we avoid that.
No, I totally get it. But yeah, just beginning to look at primary literature earlier.
And when you say primary literature, because there will be some people listening to this who hear that and think, I don't know what that is.
Yeah, published scientific reports. And with a caveat,
the stuff that people have actually published that you're supposed to be doing stuff like.
With the caveat being that there's a lot of crap that gets published as well. Oh,
I'm glad you said it, because either Zach or I was going to say it at some point.
Not every scientific report that is published is actually a useful report. If they have a sample size of 3 and they're using that to extrapolate data for an entire population across the United States, take it with a grain of salt. Yes, that is a paper I've actually read.
Yeah. So, I am going to interrupt briefly to make one comment. I mean, anyone is free at any time to jump in on any of this. My hope, my fervent prayer, really, is that by the end of this, we will all it'll just be a cavalcade of us talking over each other, and the formality of it will just completely degenerate. I do want to kind of kick it over to the history majors at this point. And I don't have a question that's more specific
Can I chime in with a question?
Yeah, please.
Because I have a question for the science people.
Then
tell me if this is off topic.
My question was going to be, what are your thoughts? This sounds like your thoughts.
Okay.
Shoot.
Yeah. So since leaving Hamilton, I work with a lot of scientists at like the Department of Environmental Protection or whatever, and they in no way are able to write in a way that people can understand, and that causes a lot of stress in the general public when they read scary science words, even if it just turns out it means like there's fluoride in your water. And I guess I'm wondering how, or if there is any effort to teach you guys as bio and chemistry majors how to communicate with people who have not taken any bio or chem since high school, which I haven't. And Fane, if that's off topic, please tell us.
Very, very little is off topic.
That is an extremely relevant thing that is not taught enough of. I can tell you I had one class in my entire bio career at Hamilton that asked me to do that. Okay.
Oh boy.
I'm going to actually, David, you go first, and then I'm going to put you and Rachel on the spot again very briefly.
Yeah, I kind of echo that in that I also had that very rarely brought up. It was in kind of more of a holistic science writing class I took, where we learned about other types of writing, including like grant writing and that sort of stuff as the other types of scientific writing. That a little bit more interesting, and only really there did they touch on the concept of like, how do you outreach to people who are not in the field? Because so much of what you're learning is like, how do you learn to think and write like someone in the field so that you can communicate with other people like that, as opposed to like, how do you go the other way?
Okay. So, I mean, that all makes perfect sense. And frankly, I could probably complain at length about similar things in composition studies literature, quite ironically, and English literature articles, etc. But I do want to I'm skewing heavily towards the science people, but oh well. I want to put you two on the spot for a second, starting with David. David, I can't remember what your thesis was. I would like for you to, bearing in mind that our audience is intended to be mainly first-year college students, can you explain your thesis briefly in a way that would help the people listening to this not only understand what you did, but why on earth it might have mattered? Why on earth it might have been an interesting and useful thing to study and figure out something about.
All right. Yeah. So the
no pressure.
No problem. So the formal thesis name for my thesis was Radical Cascade Ring Bicyclizations via Nickel-2 Catalyzed Suzuki Reactions. So
you had that up to read, didn't you?
I did. I looked this up. Yeah.
Good Lord. Actually, run that by me one more time.
So my thesis was titled Radical Cascade Ring Bicyclizations via Nickel-2 Catalyzed Suzuki Reactions.
I feel like I need to take a deep breath after listening to that.
I almost understand that.
Yeah.
And I'm a chemist, or I'm a bio.
I think I understood the individual words.
And a fireball leaps from his palm.
Right. I heard something about radicals on bicycles, so I'm like, protests during the Tour de France. That's what I'm getting out of this.
Yep.
Sorry, go on.
Yep. So it's a crazy title that means almost nothing to anyone who isn't like in the field specifically. So as a way to explain this, so my thesis worked on basically starting a new reaction. So in organic chemistry, a huge part of it is just ways to have carbons bond to each other. So molecules are made up of atoms bonding to each other, and organic chemistry is all about the chemistry of carbon, the molecule of life. So what I was trying to do is there are ways to make chemical bonds with carbon, but they're usually really hard and not nearly as effective as what we need to make very special molecules. So what I was working on is a relatively new way of creating carbon-carbon bonds using the metal nickel. So each part of my thesis, so radical. So radical indicates that there were unpaired electrons in my reactions, which is something that usually is pretty unusual and fairly chaotic. But what was novel about my process is we could do it in a very controlled way. Cascade indicates that a lot of things happened at once. Basically, my process for my reaction has, I think, like 17 steps in it. So it was a pretty long and like complicated process. Then, so the ring bicyclizations part. So another big part of organic chemistry is carbon rings. So you'll have a certain number of carbons, say like 3, 4, 5, or 6, and you can make rings of that. And that creates the backbones for lots of molecules like your hormones and your steroids and cholesterol and things like that. They're all involved with rings. So making rings is really important for drug synthesis. So what was novel about the reaction I was doing is we were making 2 rings at once. So that's like basically doing a bunch of crazy things in one single step, which is like pretty impressive in terms of like being able to create something so complicated and normally so hard to produce in one step. So that was what was kind of cool about that. And then so the other parts of it are nickel-2 catalyzed Suzuki reactions. So this is a technique that was developed roughly in the 90s. And I think the guy who developed it got a Nobel Prize like a couple of years ago for it. So Suzuki reactions are where you take a metal, most notably we use nickel-2, which is, so nickel-2 indicates that it's nickel that has the positive 2 charge on it. So it's like, you know how sodium in sodium chloride is like a salt? So it's like that, as opposed to when we say sodium, you mean that's like a metal, but we don't work with the metal, we work with the salt. So that's what nickel-2 there. So it's a nickel salt. And that acts as a catalyst for our reaction. Yep. So that's most of what that's what my title indicates. In kind of.
Can you say the title for us again?
So the title. Yep. So now that we've broken down, the title again is Radical Cascade Ring Bicyclizations via Nickel-2 Catalyzed Suzuki Reactions. Yep.
I think that's more about your thesis than I've ever understood. Cool.
I think I actually partially understood that title the second time you read it.
Yeah,
I say partially, but
yeah, it's very dense in what it's trying to communicate, but you can explain every single part of it, and it explains what I did. Yep.
Wow,
actually kind of cool.
Yeah, and so David, for making the so you're essentially trying to find an easier way to make a carbon-carbon bond.
Yep, that's the real simple of it.
That carbon-carbon bond could then be applicable for lots of things, I assume?
Yeah, so I was developing a technique for synthesis. So basically, I'm trying to be like, all right, here's a way to make this sort of compound.
Okay.
So what I was trying to make is 2 5-membered carbon rings attached to each other.
Okay, and that compound would then be used, might be used in what type of stuff?
So it could be used in some sorts of compounds that involve many ring structures.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Nothing specifically that I was working on trying to develop, but it's a structure that's found in some sorts of motifs. I think the most notable one is it's similar to, I think it's a human hormone. I think it might be it's some steroid. It has the motif of 2 5 carbon rings, and there's a bunch of other 6s on there as well. But
okay, yeah, I probably know that chemical. That sounds very familiar. But yeah, okay.
Yeah, I forget losing the name, but it's a structure in a hormone. It's something we use in some sorts of medications.
Okay.
But the 2 5-membered rings is the difficult part of it to synthesize.
Okay.
For a variety of reasons involving kinetics and thermodynamics, that's not really favorable to make very easily.
Right. So you're looking at synthesizing making, for an easier word, making the first step in a process of creating a molecule that could be used for some medications or extra. Yeah.
Yep.
And Matt, what were your findings?
So my findings, so some like backstory of this. So I wasn't the first person to work on this.
Yeah, here's the fun part of science.
Yeah. So I'm continuing the research of other people. So my thesis advisor, when I was coming to him to think of like, what can I do for my thesis? He basically has like, so these are some projects that I was working on that I've had with students, and they can be like, this is where they ended up. But as always, there's more to go in all of these sorts of things. So I continued the research of many of his other previous thesis students. So we were kind of starting off with, we had kind of thought of ways to make these compounds, but there were some difficulties in that there are some things we would attach to the rings that would influence the behavior of whether we could do this or not. And so basically where I was going to take off was basically, we got this to work in some cases, but not all cases. So what I was going to do is kind of just get to where the other students had reached and then do more variations and trying to see if we can understand why this works and what affects where, and just try and understand more about the reaction and see where we can apply it in different places.
That's fascinating.
So, yeah. So that's where I was starting off. When I actually got into the bulk of it, I ran into a lot of issues. I touched on earlier where I was like, talked about how I thought I understood the research that came before me. And I was looking at the lab notes and I'd be like, all right, I will do this procedure. And it didn't work.
No, well,
a common reoccurrence in chemistry. You'll just feel like I'm doing it exactly the same and it's not working. What's going on?
Following the
here?
instructions.
Yeah, exactly. And then you always find out things are way more complicated than you think it is, because a lot of these mechanisms are very sensitive to things like you have a little bit of oxygen, doesn't work, or the person had a little bit of oxygen and thought they didn't, and that's why it works.
Oh goodness.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
So that's genuinely fascinating. And here's where I guess I'm trying to segue back to the history of people, because I want to ask one or both of you guys to give us a similar rundown of your thesis. Doesn't have to be quite very in depth. But I'm fascinated by the fact that you're able to make that fascinating, David. And I imagine there's very little. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I imagine there's very little language in the actual thesis that talks like that. Is that fair?
I give most summarizations of what I'm talking about. My thesis has a little bit of that. My thesis is good. Yeah, my thesis my thesis is different from a normal scientific article. My thesis is like, let me see.
You don't have to read us the whole thesis, David.
Oh yeah, my thesis.
In fact, I think I'd rather switch over to the other guys for a while. This has been
I was just going to chime in and say my thesis is like 60 pages, so like I'm much more flowery than the average person. Most of it's just charts. Don't worry.
I want an in-depth description of the charts, please.
All right.
I would like you to just paint us a picture, why don't you, of the whole carbon ring radical bicyclists, something or other, whatever. This is recorded, so I can go back and watch it later if I forget. So history people, I don't really care which of you does it first, or if we only hear from one, but I'd kind of be interested in hearing one of you all give us a similar rundown for the audience of this podcast for what your thesis was.
Sure. I will go ahead. I wrote about a British explorer named Richard Burton. He lived between 1820 and 1891. And I looked at how he imagined himself to fit into the world and how that affected his own writings and his own creation of his personal, I'm going to say, brand, and how it can and should affect how we imagine him.
You've been preparing that for the last several minutes, haven't you?
I totally have.
That sounded so rehearsed.
Also,
I mean, he was clear, don't get me wrong, and that's good. Like, it's good that you spend time talking about it, but I'm like, say more words that you did not plan.
Okay. Specifically, I looked at a poem that he wrote that was published once, and then his wife bought and burned almost every copy. It was about a guy who was walking home in London. He tripped over a stone. The cobblestone turned out to be alive, and they had a long argument about whether Britain is like a morally righteous nation. And he published this under a pseudonym. Obviously, his wife didn't want to get out. So I looked at the tension between like these things he clearly thought that the things that it seemed like he thought that the stone was saying, and this kind of like buffoon that he had representing the idea of British moral supremacy. And like he was also just a really weird guy that no one in Britain thought was British. So he dressed up as an Arabic man and was the first white man to go on the pilgrimage to Mecca and live. He translated a bunch of books into English, like the Quran and the Kama Sutra. And all of these things kind of like served to distance him from the people of Britain, and affected how he translated those things and how we understand, therefore, a lot of translations of the Quran and the Kama Sutra and the Arabian Nights.
Oh, neat.
That's fascinating.
Interesting note that I do feel I want to chime in with now. The Kama Sutra is one of a book of 3 household governance manuals. It involves such things as how to hire good help and how to cook things for your dinner. And those were not included in Burton's translation, as you might imagine.
So that's
interesting.
Very interesting from top to bottom. But I do want to... What's fascinating to me, and I don't quite know why, or maybe I do know why, but it's a very long explanation, is the difference in how you sounded when you were talking, how you sounded in your speech between the very rehearsed and perfectly clear and well-constructed explanation of what the thesis was, and the more sort of off-the-cuff explanation. And obviously these are thoughts that you spent a very long time thinking, so they're things that you know very well, and that would have made it probably easier to go off the cuff about them. But one thing I'll say, and I guess this is my own thoughts on learning to write, it took me until my 3rd year to realize that it was better for me to go off the cuff when I was writing rough drafts. Like really realize.
The shitty first draft?
Sure
Sorry, crappy first draft.
Yes, exactly. But like to realize it on a not just lip service level. I can remember specifically I think I was in KJ 250 when I realized it. I'm serious. Like I can pin this to, I can't remember the exact essay, but it was an English paper of some kind. I was frustrated. I was banging my head against the wall, like written across the entire whiteboard. And I finally got so damn frustrated with it all that I just said, screw it. I'm just going to write what I think. And I'm like, wait a minute, this is working. Like in a way, like this is letting me get my thoughts out, and then I can just clean it up afterwards. And it, like, because people would tell you, you know, or maybe they wouldn't, but you know, they could tell you when you're a first year, don't worry about your first draft. And then you'll say, that makes a lot of sense. And then you'll go and you'll write as if and then you'll write as if you've never heard it, right? You'll snap right back into your original, you know, habits, which are usually to sort of perform and make sure that everything you get down is nice sounding the first time you do it. And I guess it's, as with all these, my implicit question is like, what are your thoughts on that? And I suppose in this context, it's what are your thoughts on that in your specific disciplines? But the way you were changing up your register, I guess would be the proper linguistic term, is interesting to me. I don't know what any of you think about any of that.
I mean, it makes sense to me. I know for my part, one of the hardest things to learn was just how to have fun writing an academic paper, because it's not even a matter of, you know, whether you're writing off the cuff or speaking off the cuff. It's a matter of just relaxing into it and not, as you said, thinking like everything is carved into granite when it comes out of your pen or your keyboard or your mouth. But
I can say, as a theater minor, there are few disciplines that I have taken classes in that teach you this better than theater. Writing in theater is a bit of a joke because the final product quite literally very rarely matters. The entire point of you turning in any form of writing to the professor is literally just to prove that you've done some thinking on the character work that you're working on. So there is no pressure to create a good final draft. The entire point of your writing is to just, like, I feel like theater writing is a cross between journal writing and fiction. Like you're just writing a stream of consciousness, and when you run out of stream of consciousness, you start making things up. And that's fine, because sometimes there's only so much you know about a certain character, and if you don't know why they have this scar on their cheek, then you make up a reason, and that goes into your character analysis, and that matters. And so I feel like as a theater minor, that did a really nice job. And it really wasn't until later on that I kind of realized it, but it definitely did a good job teaching you to just be like, you know what? Just write, like stream of consciousness.
And
sorry, go on.
No, go ahead. I'll remember my thought for later.
This is just, it took me a long time to learn this too, despite, you know, the fact that you were saying it to me quite a lot. It took me until I was taking a history class with Trivedi and writing précis every week, which is like, it can't be more than 2 pages, and it has to like make a really clear, concise point, use a lot of evidence. It basically summarizes an entire book. And it's really hard to summarize 400 pages in 2 pages. So I ended up just like writing whatever I think I need to get down, and then going back and saying, I can say this shorter, I can say this clearer, but like using that as a way to make sure I knew everything I wanted to include.
if I may add in there, if any of your students ever want a writing project to just help them get better at writing and thinking about their subject, what Emily just described, the précis, is like the single best exercise I've ever had to do in a class.
Could you spell it and then explain it for me?
Precis, and literally exactly what she described. You have to sum up someone else's argument or some major point you have to make. I suppose it doesn't have to be someone else's argument in 2 pages. It's highly informal. You don't necessarily need a full like introductory paragraph and conclusion. It's just a matter of absolute concision. You have to make the complete argument in 2 pages, usually double spaced. No room for fat.
And usually including footnotes.
Exactly, yeah.
Interesting. Wow, including and you probably did Chicago style too.
It's brutal, but it's an amazing exercise.
Yeah, the class I had where I had to do this every week, I swear to God, my writing improved dramatically in the course of the first 4 weeks.
Yeah. I mean, I still maintain that Professor Chambliss's sociological theory class, where we wrote a 2-page paper every week, was the best single class I had at Hamilton for my writing. Because, when he said, and podcast listeners will remember this from my conversation with Professor Chambliss, when he said write a 2-page paper, what he meant was write a 5-page paper in 2 pages. So, you had to have I had some that were 7 paragraphs in 2 pages, because you had to be just. I used italics a lot to emphasize keywords. But one thing, so God, there are a few thoughts in there. So here are 2 thoughts that I have, and whatever anyone has to say about any of this or anything else, if you want to completely ignore me, go for it. Rachel, what you're talking about, it seems very ironic to me that the discipline that is presumably the most explicitly about performing would have the least performative style of writing. And I don't know what to make of that. I'm sure there's something to make of that, but I don't know what it is. So that's one thought. And the other thought was a sort of comparison between Rachel, your point, and Emily, yours, or the scenarios you were laying out. And it occurs to me that in some way, each of you came to the realization that we were describing, that you could actually just write out your thoughts and you didn't have to worry about it being all perfect the first time. Rachel, yours seemed to be an extremely low stakes scenario, but Emily, yours was actually extremely high stakes in some sense. And that was what it was like for me, because it was almost like a desperation. Like I had to do it that way, or it wasn't going to work. But I know for a fact that in a very low stakes situations, I do it, I can do it as well. And I guess the hypothesis I would derive from this would be that if you wanted to keep someone locked in that way of thinking, where they were just doing performative writing all the time and never just thinking on paper, that the way to keep them locked in that would be to give them perpetually medium stakes writing. And I don't know if that's true. I don't know what to make of that, but it's an interesting thing to think that you would. Yeah, go. What are you thinking?
I guess my thought is I obviously took history classes freshman and sophomore year, and still did not come to this conclusion until my junior year when I took that class with the Précy. And I would not describe writing in any history class as low stakes. So I feel like it might just be like having to do something that you don't really feel matters, or something wildly outside of your comfort zone that you feel basically unqualified for.
I was saying that yours were high stakes.
But I guess I just don't feel like high stakes was enough to make me realize this, because I had
okay.
before I took it.
Extremely high stakes.
Yeah,
if
it's not possible stakes.
If I can weigh in a little bit.
No. Okay, fine.
Well, I was going to say the Précy thing, I think, taught me something a little different than Emily did. It taught me concision, which, as you all know, and as you especially know from reading my writing, Thane, I have a very French writing style, which is kind of very flowy and long sentences. And so the Précy taught me to be rigidly structured and to cut my writing down. What taught me to have fun with it was actually a film class where we had to do something similar to what Rachel described. But Professor McDonald basically wanted incredibly long and in-depth analyses of what we wrote. He didn't really care about style, but he wanted it to be not what we wrote, what we'd seen in the class. It was an avant-garde film class, and he wanted it to be like covering every possible thought we could have about this thing. And I remember there was one night that I stayed up an entire night and wrote 120 pages. And that was the moment where I was like, you know what, I don't have time to worry about, each word being carved in granite, like I said. I just have to sit down and get my thoughts out and just attack this from every possible angle I can. And, that experience kind of made me loosen up about it. And I think
I
that's kind of
remember
what,
you writing for this class. I remember that.
I remember this
Yeah.
too. Can we repeat very briefly? You wrote how many pages in one night?
120.
Yeah. Okay. So just as a
They were not
footnote
good
on
pages.
the conversation for any Versiers who may be listening, that's how powerful this way of writing is. I'm sure, and I think you were just saying this, and I talked over you, Zach, that most of it was probably crap, but it was 120 pages.
Absolutely.
And presumably you could go back and make it better if you wanted to.
And there was some good stuff in there. It was just unrefined to an extreme. Anyway.
But that's okay, because that's the whole point, right? This is the thing. I hate it when, and this is not about you, I hate it when students are apologetic about their bad writing. When they look back at the draft that they've written, and they're like every time someone comes into office hours or a writing conference, they're like, well, it's not good. It's like, it's not good. It's like, I know. What, you thought I was expecting, like, Shakespeare? Bad writing is the prerequisite to good writing. That's what I would say. And that's not just an excuse to do bad writing. It's actually an injunction to do it in some sense. It is actually, no. You better write a bad first draft. Not you. It's not that you get to. You better write a bad first draft. And you better make that your business. And you better go into it expecting and trying to write a bad first draft, because otherwise you're going to be trying to write a good first draft, and that's going to be bad. And I don't know. That's my little rant in a series of rants. But
I think the other thing that I've learned that's kind of a sidebar related to this is that, and it took me until my second semester senior year at Hamilton to discover this fully. And I had kind of had inklings of this along the way, but it wasn't really until that class that I discovered it. And I realized that from high school through, most of the time, we're taught to form an idea, form a thesis, and then set about proving that thesis. And all of our research should be related to that thesis.
And that's so backwards.
And that's so backwards. And so what happens is that
I see yours.
Exactly where I'm going with
Zach, we'll come to you in a moment.
Sometimes you start writing your thesis, and you build all this evidence, and you realize that I'm trying to prove this thing, and what I actually ended up doing is disproving this thing. Or what I actually ended up finding is this is a stupid argument, and there is zero reason why I should be making it. And so I was like, we had to write a term paper for a classics course that I did in college, and it was this 10 to 15 page 20% of your final grade. It was a huge term paper, and we had stages of it that we had to turn in, and I had already turned in my layout of my thesis and what I was going to do, and I think I turned in the first page of my outline, and I was working on the rest of my outline, and we read Antigone that week in class. And my term paper was completely about something entirely different. It was about violence in ancient Rome and gladiators as compared to violence in current film. And I started writing the thesis, and I was like, this is interesting to me as a philosophical concept, but has no relevance in a paper. It's just pointless. And I emailed my professor and I was like, can I change my term paper? I want to write about Antigone instead. And I ended up writing about Antigone's world, the role in the world of the mafia, because I was also in this mafia class. And I sat down and I wrote my entire outline in an hour for a 10-page paper. And I was like, oh. So I think if you allow yourself to let your thesis change, or completely throw out your argument and make a new one, if you find out that it doesn't work, that's okay.
Just a quick chime in. That actually happened to one of my fellow chemistry majors, where they were doing some research and then they found some anomaly, and they're just like, well, this is interesting. And then they studied it more and it's like, wow, this anomaly is way more interesting. I'm going to change my thesis research completely to try and figure out what the hell happened here. And they discovered a new mechanism.
Right.
Oh, that's so cool.
Wait, what?
Like you can
Yeah.
find really cool stuff.
Oh yeah, this happens all the time in science where you're studying one thing and then something else interesting happens and you're just like, well, I didn't expect that to happen. So
That's
I'm going
what
to be
happened in my thesis. Like that's literally what happened in my thesis. Yeah.
I do want to come back to Zach when we were first mentioning that starting with a thesis and then setting out to prove it is, or setting out to relate that thesis is backwards. You were mentioning something, and then you seem to be agreeing with more of what we said. What are your thoughts?
So that was half of a joke and half of a point that I wanted to make afterwards, which is basically that while I agree with you and it's a good idea to start without like a firm idea in mind, or to be willing to change your mind later on, like I wholeheartedly agree with that. I just want to put in the asterisk of most essays that I read that need work. The single biggest thing they need is that thesis and is the topic sentences to be tightened up to speak to the thesis. So like, while I agree with you wholeheartedly, I just want to emphasize the necessity of those mechanisms still. They have their place. It's just their place is almost more on the back end. In order for the finished product to be strong, they're probably the single most important component. But
oh yeah, they're completely needed. I fully support theses. Like obviously you need a thesis and you need the topic sentences. It's just that if you start with one and it ends up not being right, you can change it, but you still need it. Or you need a version of it.
The point that you're making there is, yes, I wholeheartedly agree. I want to make sure that, well, before I say that, let me make sure I understand it. Are you drawing or operating on a distinction between the writing process as a means of testing your thesis and possibly revising it on the one hand, and on the other hand, the actual way you have structured your argument in the finished product of your paper?
Exactly. So basically, keep in mind that the end goal is still to have that thesis. You can't forget about it. And I realize that's not at all what you were saying. It's the first thing that popped into my head. And so
Well, I'm very glad you mentioned it, though, because it's something that when I try to impress what we've been saying on my students, that you need to write a bad first draft, that what you just said is often what they leave off, is that when I say you should be willing to change your thesis, I mean over the course of your writing process, over the weeks that you spend writing it, not really over the course of your paper, right? It's your finished product should very clearly state a thesis at the top, at least to my, if you're writing for me, it should state, just tell me what you're going to argue, and then very clearly lay out, well, here's what in each paragraph, here's what this paragraph's going to argue, and it should be clear how that logically relates to your thesis.
I think my favorite way it's ever been put, to me at least, was Professor Strout, who taught Shakespeare.
I worry that.
Oh, sorry.
You broke up a little bit, Fane. Say that again.
I was saying that I worried that I broke up. So.
Oh. You're good now. Go ahead, Zach.
I was just going to say another way of putting the same thing would be how he put it to me, which was like, it made something that I've been struggling with since high school crystal clear, which is your thesis is your main argument. Every topic sentence from there on is a step forward from the thesis, and the conclusion is a step forward from the paper that's basically looking forward to how this is relevant beyond your paper.
That was super relevant too. Strout said the exact same thing to me. But that idea of a conclusion telling why your argument is important and not just being a summary of your argument is very, very helpful, not just in making a good conclusion, but also making it easier to understand why you're writing the paper. Like if you have an idea of why your paper and the argument in which that you're making in it is important, it makes it easier to write the argument.
Well, and
I want to third that because Strout said that to me too, and I had never really known what to do with the conclusion.
So I drew up this little thing real quick. I'm going to make this point. So this is actually the metaphor that I got from Ben Dwightis, who was, I mean, he was a great teacher as well, but the way he described it to me was that, your essay is a set of stairs. And this is where you learn, by the way, that I'm not an art major. And you start here, and your thesis is basically, look, we're going to that landing. And then like each paragraph takes you up and forward and up and forward and up and forward, and then you're at the top. And then your conclusion is everything you can see from the top of the stairs that you couldn't see from the bottom. That was the way that clicked for me. But the thing I've come to think more recently is that, it's very easy to get caught in the, well, it's like, if the question is, why does your paper matter? Then a lot of students are going to think, what do you mean, why does it matter? Like, it doesn't. Give me a grade, right? And I think that the question of why your paper matters does not make sense unless it is lodged within a context of a conversation about the topic you are talking about. That is to say that, David, to go back to your point or your thesis, you were continuing work that had already been done, and presumably, some poor sap of a chemistry student is going to get to pick up where you left off. And so the significance of your thesis becomes quite clear. It's like, it's continuing this process. And then you can say, well, further research should do this. Mm-hmm. And it's like, well, saying further research should do this presumes there's an ongoing conversation among scientists and researchers that are who are interested in that question. Yeah. And, I think it's very easy if you're writing in a sort of social vacuum, at least that's the way you're approaching it in your head. It's very easy to lose the thread that would become your conclusion.
Yeah.
I think it's also, there aren't a lot of teachers out there, teachers and professors, and I only had one who did it overtly and a couple who did it kind of by understanding, who were very clear. Like, I had one professor who was very clear with his class about, he was careful to always tell us why he gave us assignments. And he said in the beginning of the semester, if you ever don't understand why I'm giving you an assignment or why you're doing this, ask me. And I feel
that's like so important.
It's so important. And I feel like so many teachers see that as, or can see that as, an insult. Like, why are you giving me this assignment? What does it all matter? When really, that's a question that every student should be asking, or should at least have some knowledge of for every assignment. Because if they have a reason why they're doing an assignment, then that just hands you a little bit of a, why does this matter?
Yeah, you might care a little bit more.
Right, exactly. And if you don't agree with it, well, then fine. But, at least there is a logical reason behind it, regardless of whether or not you agree with it.
It's funny you should mention that, because one of the big problems I see in people's writing, actually, when I do, help people edit, which I still do now and then, is that they do exactly what you're describing in their writing, where they'll be like, I have these points, but I just kind of assume that my audience understands and can connect those dots. Whereas you kind of have to pretend your audience is stupid. And I realize that a professor shouldn't pretend that their audience is stupid, but for the purposes of, explaining the thesis that is the course,
right?
It does have an effect. I mean, yeah. You're right.
No, I literally have a section of my assignments where I say, purpose of the assignment.
Yeah.
And I explain to you, here is the pedagogical purpose of this is why I think this is a good assignment to give you. And
yeah,
and I beat them over the head with that until they probably are sick of hearing me say it. But I mean, Zach, you make a good point, which is that I think you can boil a lot of writing problems down to people telling you what they're telling you, but not why. And you may be able to do the same. A lot of teaching problems are perhaps people telling you what they're teaching you, but not why. Because the why is the glue that holds it all together. None of it makes sense otherwise.
And I think it's really important for students, and obviously going out to anyone listening to this, that you can ask. Like,
yeah. Just don't be an ass about it.
They spend a lot of time thinking about
ask it honestly if you're genuinely interested.
Right. Ask politely, but ask, especially when you're in college. I mean, you're paying for that education. You should know why you're learning what you're learning. And I think a lot of times we assume that, well, the professor knows more than us in the course, so they must have a reason for giving us this assignment, so whatever. But if you know that reason, if you're willing to ask that question, you're going to gain a lot more from the class. And most likely your grades will go up because
Well, and also
you'll
maybe you
understand
find
how
out that the professor doesn't have a good reason, and then that's a class you should drop.
yeah, that too.
Which I point out, not because I think you should be dropping classes willy nilly, but because you should be dropping classes when you should actually be dropping classes. Like, it's a real question.
Yeah.
It's not a fake question. If you're only asking it and you're always going to assume that whatever the professor tells you is a fair answer, and you're never willing to say, I disagree with that, I'm going to drop the class, then what you're really asking when you ask what the purpose of the assignment is, what you're asking is, what should I tell myself to believe that this is worth doing?
Yeah.
What should I tell myself, whether it is true or not, that would motivate me to do this? And that's not the question you should be asking.
Right.
So most of the time they'll have good reasons. I mean, there's a reason they're employed, hopefully. But you have to actually ask the question if you want to register the answer to yourself in a way that makes sense and works.
And you might not always get the answer that you agree with, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a stupid reason. It's possible that that's something that you've never encountered before, and so it might be something.
Maybe you're stupid, and maybe you'll be a little less stupid.
So yeah, I wouldn't say, if you don't agree with the reason for the assignment, just drop the class, but take it under consideration, look at why you might be disagreeing with it or agreeing with it, and go from there.
Emily has looked like she's wanted to say something.
Yeah, I have a thought on this as regards to history that I'm not totally sure how to phrase, so I'm just going to make you guys work through it with me, and Zach, tell me if I'm going off the rails. But in history, in high school, it's a lot of here is the dates and names and times. And a lot of kids are just like, why does this matter? We don't need to know what day the Declaration of Independence is signed. So that's a silly reason as one silly example. But when you start doing history in our college history department, at least, no one is saying this outright, to me at least, but one of the things I learned is that you have to imagine the past with empathy. You have to try and understand where the people who were doing this thing were coming from. And that's not something that the professor goes up to you on the first day and is like, I'm going to teach you to understand where Southern slaveholders are coming from. And I'm not saying I think that they were coming from a good place, but by the end of those classes, you can say, I understand what created their worldview. And that practice of being understanding, not anachronistically moralizing, is something that you just kind of learn over the course of these assignments, even when that's not the stated goal.
And would you say that, and I ask this because I have maybe a similar thing in bio, would you say that some of the information that you were told to memorize in high school, the names, the dates, the places, having that memorized has some relevance to being able to understand these later things, like having that background data of also at this time this was happening, and so that affects.
Yeah, I would, because in high school you learn the dates and general overview of what happened in the Civil War, and then in college you learn that actually the Civil War was the last great religious war, and not having to go over all of that basic scaffolding saves a lot of time.
I'd actually. Oh, go on.
No, go ahead, Zach. Continue.
I was just going to say I completely disagree with that. Actually,
I think, excellent. It took us only an hour. Go.
I think the way that they teach history and most subjects, honestly, in high schools is actually, well, I won't say most subjects. Subjects like history, where it's related to things that happened in the past, I think it's a huge disservice because, first of all, there are exceptions here, of course, but basically, when you
say it, people will take you in the best faith possible.
Well, all I'm trying to say is that the emphasis on fact is itself a disservice to students. First of all, because it turns them off from the study of history. This is fundamentally a huge story that's going on and that's continuing to go on to this day. And, the number of classmates and, people who've just talked to me and they have no interest in it because it's all been dry dates and facts is incredibly sad to me, especially because it's relevant to our present time and it's just fun. Like, it's good for teaching empathy, it's good for learning how things got to be the way they are, and it's good for honing all of these skills, and yet nobody has any interest in it because they're taught in this way. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I don't think anyone remembers those dates and facts by the time they get to college. I know I didn't, and a lot of those dates and facts I still don't remember. So there's that aspect. Then a lot of the things that I did remember when I got to college, they turned out to be just plain wrong. Like, not even like a little bit right. Like, things like, the way American history is taught from either like an apologetic or a really jingoist perspective, and there's no real in between. And so I guess there's no nuance to it. And so the things I think that history is good at teaching could be taught without that background while being more interesting and more engaging. And I feel like I'm rambling now, but I'll bring it to a close.
No, I just want to chime in here and say we don't disagree as much as you think, because I do agree that the way we teach history in high school is terrible. And it is no fun, to most people. And it doesn't get at what the point of history actually seems to be, which is that level of, first of all, it's a great story, and it helps you to have more empathy. So we definitely agree on that, because it could be a lot better, and it could save us a lot of time, like in college, if you don't have to spend 2 years being like, what is this thing that we're like kind of talking about but never quite addressing? And your point on your other points is very well taken, I think. But also, I'm not, just from a logistical standpoint, I don't know how we can do it any differently, if that makes sense. Like, without the dates and names, and like that stuff is important as like a framework to make sure we're talking about the same thing.
Maybe we'll solve that on the second biannual writing
right.
roundtable. No, I'm using that. I finally found the place where I could segue into a conclusion for the episode, so I just jumped on it. So here's what I would like to do. This has been fantastic. We have gone a little longer than I was expecting. I appreciate you all for hanging in there with me. So it is now 9:51, and at 9:56, 5 minutes, I'm just going to end the podcast, like, even if someone's in the middle of a sentence. So it's a hard stop, and if we're cut off, then that amuses me a lot, and that'll be great. But I would like any sort of closing thoughts from any of you or all of you. And again, coming back to sort of the implicit opening question, which is, what was challenging about learning to write in your particular discipline? And again, what do you think first years listening to this, what would you want them to know that, might have helped you? So I think whoever wants to take that away, you got 4 minutes.
Writing can be a way to figure out what you think. It doesn't have to be sitting down to write what you think exactly as you think it.
I like that. I think with bio, they're going to throw a lot of different things at you. So be ready to read through things you don't understand. And as far as writing, make sure you know the format. Format really matters in lab reports. It will be different no matter what class you're taking, but it will eventually come together to be one format. And don't mess up the little things. Learn when to use who or whom, that and which. The little things actually matter, especially when you have to condense things down into a 2-column, half-a-page scientific report. You want to say it eloquently, but also correctly.
I'd like to echo most of the same things, just kind of learn what the format is, kind of get a general sense of what you want to have in your flow of how you want to present your ideas, But at beginning, everything's going to always be a little bit different. Every professor wants something that's a little bit off and probably might, we want like one over the other. But no, just like in biology, things will kind of get to a same place where you'd be like, this is how you present your ideas. And you will eventually get there, but it won't be there at first. But no, that is eventually coming, so don't get too set in your ways.
Yeah, definitely learn the format and everything everyone has said, but also don't be afraid to, when necessary, throw the format out the window and basically, be true to your ideas, because ultimately you're the only one who's going to be, and if you're not going to have fun with it, and the end product will show that. So also throw out your thesaurus
for help. Definitely thesaurus, but like talk it through with a friend, read each other's papers.
Read papers out loud. That's what Fane taught me.
Oh yeah.
They sound so different.
Something stuff.
Yeah. That's something I definitely need to pick up. Actually do editing. Seriously do this. Like, you'll learn pretty quickly, and your professors will also learn very quickly whether you did like serious editing or not. You need to do that. Finish everything beforehand, because you'll think it'll sound great when you finish it up. And then you'll look at it the next day and you'll be like, this is awful. What was I thinking? Do serious editing and allocate your time for it. It is as important as writing, if not more.
And find what editing works for you. If it's online, like on a Word doc, or if you need to print it out and write it, whatever works.
30 seconds. Who wants the final word?
The final word.
All right, you're all boring. All right. Thank you all again for your time. We will see you all, or I will see you all at least, and maybe some of these hooligans will see you too on some other date. But I'll see you next episode. You've just finished an episode of Things That First-Year Writers Need to Hear. If you enjoyed it, consider subscribing. It'd help this reach more people. And check out another episode if you want, or maybe something a bit shorter if you'd prefer.